Yo, what's going on? Mike from Mike Talk Sports. Jim Miller does it again. He proves why he's an absolute legend of the fight game, a legend of the UFC, knocking out Jesse Butler at UFC Vegas 74 in under 30 seconds. Both guys went to trade huge bombs in the pocket, and Jim Miller ended up landing that huge left hook. Let me tell you guys, who should Jim Miller fight at UFC 300? Jim Miller fighting at UFC 300 not only would be legendary for fight fans, but of course it would be legendary and monumental for Jim Miller's career. Why? Jim Miller made his UFC debut back in 2008, so he's been fighting in the UFC for over a decade now, which is absolutely incredible. Of course, he has that record for most UFC fights at 42, and he has the most UFC wins at 25. Jim Miller has outright said multiple times, especially as of late after that impressive KO, he wants UFC 300 to be his last card in his last fight, and he wants it to be his 45th fight in the promotion. So he wants to fight a couple more times before UFC 300 hits. I'll be honest, I don't think that's going to end up happening. So looking at UFC 300, of course, the plans are not made for UFC 300 in terms of when it will take place, but allegedly it will take place at around April or May of 2024, which is a very important note when we're trying to decide who should Jim Miller fight at UFC 300. So looking back at this monumental moment for Jim Miller, it all started at UFC 100, where he fought Mac Danzig in a banger of a fight. If you guys have not watched this fight and you love Jim Miller, this is a really good fight to watch at UFC 100. He ended up winning via decision. It was a very close fight. And then a couple years roll by, the UFC and Jim Miller don't really think anything of it. And then UFC 200 rolls around. Jim Miller, at this point of his career, he was a bigger name fighter. So he ended up being the second fight on the prelims of UFC 200. And he ended up fighting Takanori Gomi, who is a legend of the sport in his own right, and Jim Miller put on an absolute show, knocking Gomi out in the first round of this fight at UFC 200. So looking forward to UFC 300 and who Jim Miller should end up fighting, I really wanted him to end up fighting a guy who is on either UFC 100 or UFC 200. So looking at that UFC 100 card, it's straight up impossible for him to fight anyone on this card. Basically every single lightweight or featherweight or guy who's even close to making 155 at UFC 100 is way past their prime and hasn't fought in years. That is to be expected. That card was so long ago. Jim Miller is ancient, to be honest. And then looking at UFC 200, the only lightweight on this card outside of Jim Miller who's even close to being on the UFC active roster is Joe Lozon. But the thing is, he hasn't fought since 2019. I don't think he's going to fight ever again for the UFC or for any promotion for that matter. So Jim Miller is going to have to take on a new opponent for UFC 300. So assuming that UFC 300 is going to be around May or April of next year, I think the first name that really makes sense for Jim Miller to fight is Paddy Pimblett. So Paddy Pimblett, of course, his last fight was last year, and it was Jared Gordon. And Paddy Pimblett, let's be completely honest, guys, he's lost a lot of hype. Not only did he arguably lose his last fight, but when a guy makes his name off of being active, a guy fights 3-4 times in a year and then he doesn't fight for an entire year, he's naturally going to lose all of his hype. And that really is what has happened to Paddy Pimblett. So Paddy Pimblett has recently come out, he just had his wedding, and he recently said he wants to fight at the end of this year. So that makes perfect sense for him to make that UFC 300 card. If he fights at the end of this year, he'll be more than ready to fight on April or May of next year. And looking at Paddy Pimblett, he's a guy who needs hype injected into him, and there's no other better way of injecting some hype into Paddy Pimblett than to put him on one of the biggest cards in the promotion's history, which will be UFC 300. No matter who Jim Miller fights, he's going to get a significant amount of hype, so it might as well be a fighter who needs a little bit of life injected into his career, and this is perfect for Paddy Pimblett. Getting into the matchup and getting into the the stylistic matchup, it's a phenomenal stylistic matchup. Now, these guys look very different and they have different frames, but they really do very similar things in the octagon. First and foremost, they both have phenomenal jiu-jitsu. Now, I would say that Jim Miller is a slightly better wrestler than Paddy Pimblett, but neither guy has an incredible ability to get the fight to the ground via wrestling and via wrestling technique. This fight most likely will have a lot of grappling exchanges at some points, but for the most part, I do expect this fight to take place on the feet. And really, these guys are both good, underrated offensive strikers, decent strikers with good power behind their shots. The thing is, both guys are not great defensively. Paddy Pimblett, of course, has never been knocked out in the UFC and really has never been knocked out cold in his career, dating back to Cage Warriors. The thing is, though, of course, we know Paddy Pimblett leaves his chin wide open and he leaves it wide open in the air. And that's something a veteran like Jim Miller is absolutely going to take advantage of. We've seen Jim Miller get knocked out in similar ways. We've seen Paddy Pimblett get stunned in the octagon. Again, of course, he's never been knocked out, but this fight is going to make for fireworks. Both guys are willing to trade in the pocket, and I fully expect a knockout to happen in the first or second round of this fight. If it's Jim Miller getting knocked out, it's going to be a sad ending to his career, but it is going to be a very good thing for Paddy Pimblett to receive that hype from the UFC 300 card and from Jim Miller, the legend who's going to be fighting on that UFC 300 card. Again, I think there is going to be a lot of noise surrounding this fight heading into the week of the fight next year. In my opinion, again, a phenomenal fight to put on this UFC 300 card. If not Paddy Pimblett, I would really like to see Jim Miller fight a veteran of the fight game, a guy who's been in the UFC since 2013, and I'm of course talking about Bobby Green, a guy who's been a staple of the lightweight division, just like Jim Miller. These guys have just never faced each other and have never seen each other in the octagon, even though they have a lot of similar opponents. Both guys have fought legends. They've both fought guys like Dustin Poirier, Jared Gordon, Josh Thompson, Clay Guida, Edson Barbosa. Now, Jim Miller hasn't fought some of those guys I've named, but you get the point. They've both fought the who's who of the lightweight division. The thing is about Bobby Green, I would say 2-3 years ago, he'd pick Jim Miller apart, and this wouldn't even be that competitive of a fight. To me, Bobby Green just has not looked good in his last couple fights. In my opinion, he was losing to Jared Gordon. I thought Bobby Green would go out there and piece up Jared Gordon on the feet, and that absolutely did not happen. Bobby Green was looking stiff and rusty on the feet, and I think that's something that Jim Miller could potentially take advantage of. Again, a banger of a fight. Bobby Green has good counter grappling, but Jim Miller just recently said in an interview the one thing left of his career that he really wants to do outside of fighting for UFC 300 on that card is land a Kimura in a fight. That's something that he has in his arsenal and it has been a signature of his career in the training camp, in the training room, but that's something he's never landed in the UFC, and I think Bobby Green is a guy who's susceptible to submissions like a Kimura. So not only do I think this would be a very fun fight, but I think it's stylistically potentially a very good fight for Jim Miller. The last guy I would like to mention, now I would like to see him fight Bobby Green or Paddy Pimblett. That's number 1 and 2 on my list. The third backup option is a guy that Bobby Green and Paddy Pimblett just fought, and I'm of course talking about Jared Gordon, a guy who's been in the UFC for quite a long time at this point as well. Not nearly as long as Bobby Green and Jim Miller, but he's a guy who is a similar stature to Jim Miller. He's a guy who needs a little bit of hype injected into his career as well after having that no contest against Bobby Green, after getting robbed against Paddy Pimblett, and having a really weird pullout of his fight, admitting to the UFC he was concussed, and Dana White was really pissed at that. Now, I don't know if Dana White would ever put Jared Gordon on UFC 300, but I think it would be a very interesting stylistic matchup nonetheless. Thanks for listening, guys. Let me know in the comment section below, what are your thoughts on the legendary Jim Miller in his entire career, and who do you want to see him fighting at UFC 300?